after having lost the Battle of Ostrovno, in which it was at first thought that the entire Russian army would take part, the hope of inducing Barclay de Tolly, the Russian general, to engage in a great battle. Napoleon made his way to Vitebsk. He was tired of uselessly pursuing an army whose chief, and this is nothing but the truth, could not make up his mind to fight him. One day, the Russian general seemed full of fire, determined to retreat no further without engaging in a decisive encounter. The next day, the phantom of Napoleon's presence once more impressed itself on his mind, and all his resolutions of the day before vanished. The fact that Napoleon spent a fortnight at Vitebsk, and that during that time he gave orders for the construction of certain defenses and the establishment of a large bakehouse, gave rise to the idea that he wished to camp around this city and select this point for his line of defense. But it was impossible for him to terminate the campaign in the month of July without even having been able to come into contact with the enemy's army. The object of this halt was to rest the army which stood in need of repose and to watch the movements of the Russians. Hearing that they were leaving the vicinity of Smolensk to come and attack him, the emperor made haste to march to meet them, proceeding rapidly along the left bank of the Dnieper and ascending the course of this stream to reach Smolensk before they had had time to return there. This movement, hiding the march of the French army from the enemy, placed it on their flank and rear. The audacity and skill of this maneuver have been admired by the Russians themselves, and it has been considered the finest of the campaign. But Napoleon's star was already waning. The 8 corps commanded by General Junot went astray on the road, and Marshal Ney's attack on the citadel of Smolensk was unfortunately unsuccessful. General Barclay, tardily apprised of the movements of the French army, hastened to return to Smolensk, which was successfully defended during a whole day by 2 Russian divisions, who were shut up in this fortified place, time being thus given to the 2 Russian armies to come to the rescue. Napoleon had hoped that Barclay would not let this city, the key of old Russia, fall into our hands without a decisive battle, but he only resisted long enough to cover his retreat and operate his junction with Bagration, whose army had got past the French corps, which had been ordered to cut off his retreat. The question as to whether a halt should be made at Smolensk was again discussed between Napoleon and his lieutenants. The reason which had prompted the emperor at Vitebsk to continue his march forward remained the same at Smolensk. The French army could only have ceased its movements and have taken up its quarters in these 2 cities if one of those splendid victories to which the French were accustomed had come to give hopes for peace. The Russians, on the contrary, had fought no battle to defend this bulwark of Russia and did not show themselves, on the other hand, at all disposed to open negotiations. It was then the month of August, and it was quite out of the question for the French army to spend the rest of the summer at Smolensk. There was at that time no reason for retreating or for taking up a position behind rivers, which, frozen hard in the winter, would no longer be a protection against the enemy. We were to wait in a command of continued attitude of defense, a kind of war which is antipathetic to the French character, and a distance of 500 leagues from our frontiers, to give our adversaries time to look round and to employ for our destructions the resources of every kind which they so easily derive from their native soil? Napoleon did not think so. The Russians would at last be forced to stand to battle to defend Moscow. There is where lay peace. That is what the emperor thought. One great victory, and this great object was attained. The Emperor Alexander would be forced to retreat. This peace, added Napoleon, would have limited our war expeditions. It was the crown of our efforts, the commencement of security. During the march of the French army on Smolensk, the encounter with a Russian division gave rise to the combat of Krasnoy. It was during one of the brilliant cavalry charges which were carried out during this combat that young Marboeuf was mortally wounded. The loss of this officer gave great grief to the emperor. This young man had been presented to him by his mother, widow of Count Marboeuf, the former governor of the island of Corsica, whom she had married when a widower. When Madame de Marbeuf presented her son to the emperor in 1805, he was 20 years old. Napoleon admitted him amongst his orderly officers. The following letter, which we think right to reproduce, will show what remembrance Napoleon had retained of the interest formerly shown to the Bonaparte family by Monsieur de Marbeuf. Paris, 18 Ventos, year 8, March 9th, 1805. Monsieur de Marbeuf, officer in the 25th Regiment of Dragoons, I have granted you for life a pension of 6,000 francs on the crown treasure, and I have given orders to Monsieur de Fleurier, my intendant, to send you the warrant for the same. I am giving orders that there shall be paid to you out of my privy purse a sum of 12,000 francs for your outfit. It is my wish to give you under all circumstances a proof of the interest I take in you on account of the good recollection I have of the services rendered to me by your father, whose memory is dear to me. I rely on the hope that you will follow in his footsteps, and hereupon I pray God to have you in his holy keeping. Napoleon. The emperor, so to speak, adopted this young man, whom he intended to raise to a high degree of fortune. He had entailed a fine house at number 11, Rue de Mont Blanc, upon him. This house had been bought from the receiver, General Pirlo, and after Monsieur de Marbeuf's death, the emperor bestowed it on the Duke of Padua. Napoleon always used to treat young Marbeuf's mother with great respect. It had been related that at the time of the establishment of the imperial households, the lady mother suggested to Napoleon that he should appoint Madame de Marbeuf, one of her ladies-in-waiting, and that Napoleon refused from a feeling of delicacy. He is said to have answered, "After what Monsieur Marbeuf was for us, it would not be right for his widow to be in our service." Madame de Marbeuf, inconsolable for her son's death, separated herself from her daughter, who had married Count Louis d'Ambrougiac, who owed the favor of which he stood with the emperor to this marriage, and who was a colonel in 1813. She retired in the convent of the Sacred Heart and died there in 1839 at the age of 76, the same age at which her husband, whom she survived 53 years, had died. After having set fire to Smolensk before leaving it, the enemy continued its retrograde movement. One half of the Russian army was attacked on the heights of Valutinia Gora by Marshal Ney's corps, supported by the Gudin division. These corps performed prodigies of valor in this encounter. The inconceivable action of General Junot, in command of the Westphalian troops, in refusing to march to the rear of the Russians and cut off their retreat, saved the enemy's forces once more. Brave General Gudin had both his legs shot off by a cannonball in this engagement. As to Junot, he had disobeyed not only the repeated orders of the emperor to march to Ney's assistance, but also the pressing request of the King of Naples, Murat, who had gone to him to convince him of what he ought to do. The emperor heard what was going on at Smolensk, where he had remained, not foreseeing that this encounter might develop into a battle. When he arrived, the struggle had nearly finished, and the Russian army was continuing its retreat. Napoleon addressed the severest reproaches to General Junot, but this unfortunate general was then already experiencing the first attacks of the mental malady, which broke out with such violence a year later. The emperor had chosen Rapp, who spoke German, and who had all his wits about him, to take his place. The refusal of Rapp, who interceded for his brother in arms, and a feeling of benevolence, which Napoleon could not help feeling for the oldest of his aides-de-camp, maintained the Duc de Brantes, Junot, at the head of his army corps. General Gudin was transported to Smolensk, but all the emperor's care was unable to preserve his life. He died regretted by his sovereign and the whole army, who appreciated his eminent qualities. Gudin was buried in the citadel of Smolensk. Certain advantages gained by the right wing of the army under the command of Prince Schwarzenberg, and an important success achieved on the left wing by General Gouvion Saint-Cyr, who had replaced Marshal Oudinot, who had been seriously wounded, in command, a success which won a marshal's baton for the general, consoled the emperor in some measure for all these mishaps. The army followed the Russians on their retreat without respite. After having set fires to the cities of Gyats and Vyazma and their rich bazaars, the enemy's forces halted at last at Moyaysk. There it was learned that Marshal Kutuzov had replaced General Barclay de Tolly in the command of the Russian army. On the eve of the memorable Battle of Moscow, in the midst of serious anxieties occasioned by the murderous fight in which he was about to engage, the emperor received a portrait of his son. The empress had commissioned Monsieur de Bausset, who was proceeding to headquarters to carry the young prince's portrait to his father. In his impatience, the emperor ordered the box containing the picture to be opened at once under his eyes. The royal infant was represented sitting in its cradle playing with a cup and ball. The ball might have been taken for the globe of the world and the cup stick for a scepter. Napoleon contemplated his son's picture with an emotion which was increased by the recollection of the distance which separated him from France, as well as by the preparations for a battle which he had long wished for, but the approach of which filled him with anxiety. He ordered one of his valets to carry the picture outside his tent and to hold it up high enough that the sentry of the guards might see it. This sight brought all the officers and soldiers who were in the neighborhood running up. To satisfy the curiosity of the military crowd, which kept increasing, the emperor ordered the portrait of the King of Rome to be placed on one of the folding chairs in his tent and left it standing all day in sight of the army. The sympathy and the sentiments of all these good soldiers ended by breaking out into manifestation which deeply touched the emperor. Marshal Kutuzov awaited the French army near the Borodino in a fortified position, defended in the middle by means of a great bastion redoubt, flanked with other defense works. These redoubts, stubbornly fought for, taken by the French and retaken by the Russians in turn, remained finally in our hands. General Montbrun, and after him, General Caulaincourt, brother of the Grand Equerry, met with a glorious death there. 300,000 men fought on this murderous day in September 7th with an unexampled implacability. 800 cannon vomited forth death into the ranks of two armies. This battle, to which the Russians have given the name of Borodino, and which the French call the Battle of La Moskva, is one of the most murderous battles which were ever fought. It may rightly be styled a battle of giants. The Russians admit having lost 50,000 men killed, wounded, or taken prisoners. This enormous loss must be attributed to the passive courage which they opposed to the attacks on the redoubts, allowing themselves to be killed rather than to surrender them. The losses of the French army may be estimated at 30,000 men put hors de combat. 30 Russian generals and 15 French generals were killed, wounded, or made prisoners. The two armies, sated with bloodshed, stayed their hands towards the end of the day, the Russian army remaining master of all the positions, and the Russian army preparing for a retreat. The Emperor Napoleon has been blamed for not having completed the routing of the enemy by ordering out the Imperial Guard, which took no part in the action. He answered the remonstrances which were made on this subject with the following words: "If there's a second battle tomorrow, with what shall I fight it?" As a matter of fact, Kutuzov thought of fighting a second battle on the morrow. If the respective states of the two armies be considered, one will be seen with its back to the capital, from which it is able to draw reinforcements and resources, an army fighting for its home and animated with religious and patriotic fanaticism. The other more than 800 leagues distant from France, without any means of receiving immediate reinforcements, and obliged finally to return home sooner or later. So great a captain as was Napoleon could not commit the imprudence of remaining disarmed but for the possible return on the offensive of an adversary who did not consider himself defeated. A reserve force of 20,000 fresh men, as bold as were the Imperial Guards, could decide a victory in case a second battle became necessary. Was it not indeed the Guard which later on protected our retreat? The emperor allowed the young guard to occupy the field of battle, giving orders for its support in case the enemy, receiving reinforcements, should attempt a fresh attack during the night. After the bitterly contested day of La Moskva, Napoleon halted at a little country house situated at no great distance from the field of battle. The nights which he had passed in 4 consecutive bivouacs where he had constantly been on his legs, and the great fatigues which he had to undergo, gave him a cold, which very soon degenerated into an extinction of the voice, which greatly annoyed him. He whose hand could not suffice to write down thoughts which flooded his volcanic brain was seen reduced to the necessity of scribbling roughly the multifarious orders which had to be given in every direction on little squares of paper. On the morrow he had already got rid of this passing ailment. After an encounter which was fought outside Moscow, the encounter which at first induced the belief that the Russians really intended to defend the city, the front guard of the French army arrived in front of this old capital of the Russian Empire, and the sight of Moscow, which was to be seen from the heights, filled it with a joy which rapidly communicated itself to the rest of the army. It was hoped that repose, and especially abundance, would be found there. A curious and impressive sight was the sudden appearance of this great city, Asiatic rather than European, spreading out at the end of a desert and naked plain, topped with its 1,200 spires and sky-blue cupolas, strewn with golden stars and linked one to the other with gilded chains. This conquest had been dearly paid for, but Napoleon at that time lulled himself in the hope that he would be able to dictate peace there. The King of Naples, who entered it first, sent word to the emperor that the city appeared to be deserted, and that no civil or military functionary, nor nobleman, nor priest had presented himself. The Russian army had taken away the majority of the inhabitants of Moscow in its train. Some Russian and foreign dealers who had managed to escape this order came to see the emperor and implored him to protect them against the pillaging with which they thought themselves menaced. There had remained in the city only a few thousand people belonging to lowest classes of society who had nothing to lose by awaiting the course of events. Napoleon passed this night of September 14th in the Dorogomilo Faubourg and only entered Moscow on the morrow. This entry was not accompanied by that tumult which marks the taking possession of a great city. No noise disturbed the solitude of the city's streets, save only the rumbling of the cannon and the artillery caissons. Moscow seemed to sleep, in deep sleep, like in one of those enchanted cities in which we read in the Arabian tales. The streets through which we passed were lined with houses of fine appearance, for the most part, with closed windows and doors. Palaces with colonnades, churches, and beautiful buildings glittering with the luxury of Europe and of Asia raised themselves side by side with very modest habitations, all bespoke the ease and wealth of a great city entrenched and enriched by trade, and inhabited by wealthy and a numerous aristocracy. Some of the principal houses which we were able to enter were well appointed and well furnished, many even magnificently so, and their inhabitants did not appear to have abandoned them forever.